The Japan Meteorological Agency recently issued, for the first time in history, a caution warning for the Nankai Megathrust earthquake. What does this mean? What do you need to do if you're living in Japan? Here's everything you need to know about Japan's upcoming superquake. Just south of the main island of Japan is the Nankai trough, the underwater meeting place of two tectonic plates. One of these is the Eurasian land plate that Japan sits on, while the other is the Philippine sea plate, the ocean plate that cuts under the land plate. Now, as the sea plate cuts under the land plate, it drags the edge of the land plate with it, causing strain. Eventually, that bending land plate that's getting dragged down has to snap back up into place. It reaches its kind of flex limit, and this causes an earthquake. These earthquakes are called Nankai Megathrust earthquakes as they occur along, again, the Nankai trough, and they are always enormous in scale. Just how big are these earthquakes? Every Nankai Megathrust earthquake in history has been catastrophic, with an average magnitude of 8.3. For reference, the Great Hanshin earthquake of 1995 had a magnitude of 6.9, and that was enough to knock over not only multiple buildings, but also the entire highway running through the heart of Kobe City. Additionally, Nankai Megathrust earthquakes are typically not contained to a single isolated area. You see, the Nankai Trough is made up of 5 sections that run all the way from Kyushu to Tokyo, and while it's rare for an earthquake to occur along all 5 sections of the trough at once, it's actually normal for 3 or even 4 sections to rupture back to back, as the shaking from one section can cause another section to rupture. For example, on December 13th, 1854, a magnitude 8.4 earthquake occurred along the central and central east sections of the trough, C and D. And the next day, another 8.4 earthquake hit the 2 western sections of the trough, A and B. On top of this, because these earthquakes are caused by the land plate snapping back up under the water, the earthquakes are almost always accompanied by equally, if not even more devastating tsunami. The Meio Nankai earthquake of 1498 caused a tsunami so large that it washed away the temple of the great Buddha of Kamakura, and this is a place that's almost a kilometer inland. And the Hoei earthquake of 1707, which did occur along all 5 faults, caused a tsunami that was up to 25.7 meters in height, or about 85 feet tall. To make matters worse, evidence strongly suggests that these earthquakes also lead to increased volcanic activity. Many experts believe that the terrifying eruption of Mount Fuji in 1707 was triggered by that Hoei earthquake that happened only 49 days earlier. This is one of the most terrifying aspects of these earthquakes. A second disaster often occurs during the initial rescue and recovery effort. That 1707 eruption of Mount Fuji covered Yokohama, more than 80 kilometers away, in 15 centimeters of lung-ripping volcanic ash. But just how devastating would a Nankai Megathrust earthquake be to modern Japan? I imagine that most people watching remember, or maybe even some of you might have lived through, the absolutely catastrophic 2011 Tohoku earthquake. The Japanese government estimates the next Nankai Megathrust earthquake will cause approximately 10 times as much damage as the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, as much as $1.5 trillion in economic damage, and as many as 230,000 lives lost. Now, some of you may know that the 2011 Tohoku earthquake had a magnitude of 9.0 or 9.1, so you might find yourself asking, how could the next Nankai Megathrust earthquake, if those have an average magnitude of 8.3, cause that much more damage than the Tohoku earthquake? This is because every major Japanese city is located along the southern coast of Honshu, again, the main island of Japan. Tokyo, Kawasaki, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and potentially even Fukuoka. The next Nankai Megathrust earthquake will likely hit all of these cities and all of the smaller cities in between at approximately the same time, and it will hit them harder than almost any other earthquake that these cities have individually experienced in the past 100 years. The damage is practically unfathomable. But why did the Japanese government recently issue a caution warning for the Nankai Megathrust earthquake? Why do we think how do we know, rather, that another Nankai Megathrust earthquake is coming soon? Earlier we talked about the mechanism of the earthquake, how the sea plate drags down the edge of the land plate until the land plate can no longer flex and has to snap back into place. The thing is, this is not a one-time ordeal, because as soon as the land plate snaps back into place, the next section of the sea plate just starts dragging it down again. And history has taught us that the time between these snaps, between the earthquakes, is 90 to 150 years. Every 90 to 150 years, for as long as there are records, Japan has experienced a cataclysmic earthquake along its southern coast. Here's a list of just what we know. 684, the Hakuho earthquake, magnitude 8.25. 887, the Ninna Nankai earthquake, magnitude 8 to 8.5. 1096, the Eicho earthquake, magnitude 8 to 8.6. 1367, the Shohei Nankaido earthquake, magnitude 8.4. 1498, the Meio earthquake, magnitude 8.6. 1605, the Keicho Nankaido earthquake, magnitude 7.9. 1707, this is the one where all 5 sections of the fault ruptured at once. The Hoei earthquake, magnitude 8.6 to 8.7. 1854, the Ansei Nankai earthquake, magnitude 8.4. And 1944, the To Nankai earthquake, magnitude 8.1. This is why the government keeps making NHK mini-dramas and hosting TV panels about this phenomenon, because there is no scenario in which the Nankai Megathrust earthquake doesn't happen in the relatively near future. The question, of course, is when and along which sections of the trough the next earthquake will occur. The most recent Nankai Megathrust earthquake also occurred as a pair, with the first earthquake happening December 7th, 1944 in the central section of the trough, sections C and D. And the second earthquake happened December 21st, 1946, along the western sections of the trough, sections A and B. Now, it might seem like these two aren't related because of the 2-year gap in the middle, but they're usually grouped together because there hadn't been an earthquake along the trough in the 90 years prior to these two earthquakes. And takeaway point, there hasn't been an earthquake along the trough since then. That's correct. There hasn't been an earthquake along the Nankai trough since the mid-1940s, approximately 80 years ago. But wait, isn't the cycle 90 to 150 years? Doesn't that still give us plenty of time, at least another decade? Well, yes and no. The thing is, there hasn't been any earthquakes along the easternmost section of the trough, section E, since 1854, 170 years ago. Now, I'm not trying to fearmonger, so I'll follow up by saying that there is no precedent for section E of the trough rupturing by itself. Historically speaking, at least as far as we know, section E has always ruptured with other sections of the trough. That said, many experts believe that just because there isn't a historical precedent for section E rupturing first, doesn't mean that we can rule out this possibility. In fact, many believe that the likelihood of said event occurring is high. So will the next Nankai Megathrust earthquake be an unprecedented one in which section E ruptures first and causes a chain reaction along the trough in the relatively near future? Or will section E hold until a different section of the trough ruptures potentially 10 to 50 years from now? Unfortunately, only time can tell. It is certain, however, that the likelihood of the earthquake striking increases every year. And this is why the Japan Meteorological Agency recently issued, for the first time in history, a caution warning for the Nankai Megathrust earthquake. Because August 8th, a 7.1 earthquake struck off the coast of Miyazaki in the Hyuga Sea, fairly close to the western edge of the Nankai Trough. Experts thought that this could potentially cause the increasingly strained Nankai Trough to rupture. And they wanted the country to be on standby in case that very thing happened. Now, a week has already passed, so scientists more or less have ruled out the possibility of a Nankai Megathrust earthquake occurring in the immediate future. But hopefully now you understand why the government issued this warning and why we're likely to see more and more of these warnings going forward. Again, because given the current timeline, every year that passes, the likelihood of the next Nankai Megathrust earthquake occurring greatly increases. Now, I'd like to try and articulate what I think a fair number of viewers might be thinking, which is essentially, wait, Seriously? Like, how is it possible that every 90 to 150 years, Japan is almost brought to its knees by this cataclysmic natural disaster, and yet I've never even heard of it? Well, I think that there are two reasons for this. The first being that Nankai megathrust earthquakes are not the only kind of earthquakes, or even cataclysmic earthquakes, that Japan experiences. Again, that 2011 Tohoku earthquake, that was another megathrust earthquake, but it wasn't a Nankai megathrust earthquake. It occurred along a different fault. And I think the second reason a lot of people haven't heard of these earthquakes that again can hit multiple major Japanese cities, every major Japanese city at the same time, is because the last time one struck and had this cataclysmic damage, there was a whole lot going on all around the world. What else was happening in December 1944? Well, the Allies were fighting the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge. And what was happening in December 1946? Well, the entire world was doing its best to recover from the worst conflict that it had ever seen. Most people probably haven't heard of a Nankai megathrust earthquake because Japan is already known for other really bad earthquakes. When the last Nankai megathrust earthquake occurred, the world was preoccupied. And when it comes to the Nankai megathrust earthquakes before the most recent one, well, I speculate that most people don't know about those because they just kind of get lost in the thick pages of history. That said, I'd like to make the counterpoint that most people actually do know about these earthquakes, just in an indirect way. You see, these earthquakes, along with the other earthquakes that Japan regularly experiences, they're one of the big reasons that Japanese culture is the way that it is. They're one of the reasons that Japanese products are so well built and that everything is double and triple checked here. They're one of the reasons why everyone works so hard here and why cooperation, why teamwork is so highly valued. Because the history of Japan, the history of the people living on this small, isolated island nation is one of, among other things, working through some of the worst natural disasters that mankind has ever known. Again, we all saw this in real time in 2011. There's never been room in Japan for sloppiness or laziness or for going it alone because these things have always meant certain death when the next natural disaster inevitably hit. Which brings me to my final point. It's generally perceived that Japanese people and foreigners in Japan are separate. Japanese people often treat foreigners as the other, and foreigners in Japan, myself certainly included, like to talk about how Japanese something is and laugh at the idiosyncrasies of Japanese culture. What I'd like all of us to try and remember today is that many of these idiosyncrasies were born from the natural disasters that would probably be anomalies in our home countries, but are essentially everyday life in Japan. 20% of all the earthquakes that happen every year happen in and around Japan. And again, every 90 to 150 years, Japan is hit by a cataclysmic earthquake that shakes the nation to its core. And this is why, while it's okay to play the gaijin card every now and then in a silly situation, we foreigners in Japan also have a very real responsibility to be prepared for the next big earthquake. If you live in Japan, you need to own an emergency pack. You need to know the location of the nearest evacuation shelter. You should probably be in decent physical shape, and at the bare minimum, you need to know basic Japanese. It's important to do these things so that the next time a major earthquake strikes, and it will sooner than later, we can all aid in the recovery effort rather than being a strain on the system. Because the faster that Japan recovers, the faster we can all get back to One Piece, Konbini, reliable trains, and Elden Ring. The Japan that we all love, and the Japan that, ironically, might not exist had it not been for these very earthquakes.